Dubai did not greet Prince Harry with ceremony. It greeted him with silence. At 2:17 a.m., beneath the sterile white lights of the Al Majlis terminal, the man once introduced to the world as a son of history stood alone beside a biometric gate that would not open. There was no red carpet, no diplomatic escort, only a quiet request from an immigration officer asking him to step aside while a verification process was completed. Before we begin today's royal update, I want to take a quick moment. Many of you watch these videos but haven't subscribed yet, and you don't want to miss the latest developments and fascinating stories from the world of royalty. Subscribing is completely free and keeps you updated as everything unfolds. While you're here, tell us, where are you watching from? Share it in the comments. It's amazing to see viewers joining us from all around the world. Harry adjusted his jacket, the gesture automatic, almost rehearsed. For years, clothing had functioned like armor. Titles did the rest. But inside the glass-walled waiting suite, stripped of movement and audience, those symbols carried no weight. The officials addressing him did not bow, did not hurry, did not react to the name on the passport. They spoke with measured politeness, the kind reserved not for royalty, but for uncertainty. 4 hours can pass quickly when one is expected. They pass differently when one is not. Harry made calls, first to advisors, then to intermediaries, then to contacts who only weeks earlier had spoken confidently about partnerships, opportunities, and introductions waiting on the other side of the desert. Each call dissolved into voicemail or vague assurances that someone would look into it. No one arrived. No doors opened. The architecture of influence he believed surrounded him revealed itself to be scaffolding without a building. Outside, aircraft continued their disciplined choreography across the runway. Inside, time stalled. This journey had not been planned as a visit. It was meant to be an arrival. Over the previous year, Harry had become convinced he was standing at the threshold of reinvention. No longer the secondary figure within an inherited institution, he imagined himself stepping into a new arena: global finance, energy, private enterprise, fields where legacy could be converted into autonomy. The project had a name, spoken often in private meetings with an air of inevitability: Amber Crude. To Harry, it symbolized independence. To those who listened carefully, it sounded like urgency. He had grown increasingly frustrated with the limitations of symbolic work: ceremonies, patronages, carefully managed appearances. Those belonged to a structure he had left behind. What he wanted now was something measurable, tangible, wealth that answered to him alone, a success that could not be compared to anyone else, especially not to Prince William, whose future seemed permanently secured by design rather than effort. In California, discussions stretched late into the night. Consultants were replaced by entrepreneurs. Protocol gave way to ambition. Harry spoke of markets instead of missions, of stakes instead of service. Some around him were energized by the shift. Others noticed how quickly caution was dismissed as negativity. Doubt had become unwelcome. The plan depended on access. Access depended on relationships. Relationships, Harry believed, depended on who he was. But institutions do not operate on belief. At 4:41 a.m., an official entered the room carrying a tablet. His expression was professional, not hostile, not apologetic. He explained that the visa attached to Harry's proposed business activities had been suspended pending review. Without it, entry could not be granted. There was no accusation, no argument, only procedure. Harry listened, waiting for a qualification, an exception, some acknowledgement that a mistake had been made. None came. For the first time since the process began, he did not respond immediately. The stillness in the room deepened. Through the glass, he could see reflections of himself layered against the terminal lights, one image overlapping another, as if even the glass could not decide which version of him belonged there. He asked if the situation could be resolved quickly. The official replied that such matters were not resolved quickly. The conversation ended there. What Harry experienced in that moment was not confrontation. It was absence. The absence of recognition. The absence of urgency. The absence of the invisible mechanisms that had once carried him forward without explanation. By dawn, arrangements were made for his departure. As the aircraft lifted back into the pale horizon, Dubai receded without comment. The city had not rejected him loudly. It had simply declined to receive him. And in that quiet refusal, The first real boundary between inheritance and independence had revealed itself. Harry did not sleep. He watched the cabin lights dim and brighten according to a schedule that felt strangely irrelevant. Time zones shifted beneath the aircraft, yet his thoughts remained fixed inside that glass room in Dubai, replaying the same unanswered question. When exactly had certainty turned into assumption? On paper, nothing irreversible had happened. No contracts had been signed. No public announcements made. The Amber Crude venture still existed as a concept, a network of conversations and draft agreements. Yet something essential had changed. The confidence that once animated every discussion now felt fragile, dependent on factors he did not control. When the plane landed in Santa Barbara County, the familiar landscape appeared unchanged. The hills were the same muted green. The house stood exactly as he had left it. Staff moved through routines with professional discretion. But the atmosphere inside had shifted. Conversations paused when he entered. Updates were delivered cautiously, framed with an awareness that the tone of the past year no longer applied. Meghan met him in the study rather than at the door. Their exchange was calm, almost procedural. She asked what had happened. He described delays, administrative reviews, misunderstandings, phrases that attempted to reduce the experience to logistics. Meghan listened carefully, not interrupting, not challenging, but also not reinforcing the interpretation. She had spent the previous weeks meeting with advisors of her own, people concerned less with opportunity and more with exposure. Brand partnerships, production timelines, reputational alignment. These had begun to intersect uneasily with Harry's increasingly opaque business pursuits. For the first time, their strategies were not moving in parallel. In the days that followed, financial briefings replaced planning sessions. Accountants outlined liquidity positions. Legal consultants requested documentation for entities that had been created rapidly during the project's expansion phase. Words like leverage, liability, and jurisdiction entered conversations that once revolved around growth and access. Harry resisted the shift at first. He insisted the project only needed recalibration, that the right introduction or endorsement could still revive momentum. But the professionals around him operated on verification, not belief. They asked for regulatory pathways, state approvals, enforceable guarantees, elements that had never fully materialized. News of the Dubai episode did not become public, yet its consequences traveled quietly through the same international networks that had once welcomed him. Responses to outreach slowed. Invitations became non-committal. Meetings were postponed without rescheduling. No one openly rejected him. They simply redirected their attention elsewhere. The effect was subtle but unmistakable. Influence, he discovered, rarely disappears dramatically. More often, it recedes through hesitation. At home, the rhythm of daily life continued, anchored by Archie and Lilibet's routines, school preparations, meals, bedtime rituals. Their presence introduced a contrast Harry found difficult to ignore. Children measured time differently. They responded to consistency, not ambition. Their world had not expanded with his plans, nor contracted with their uncertainty. It simply required him to be present. That expectation felt heavier than any negotiation. Meanwhile, Meghan's team began restructuring her professional calendar with deliberate clarity. Projects emphasizing independence and authorship were prioritized. Joint appearances were reconsidered. The language of collaboration gradually gave way to language of distinction. Publicly, nothing suggested separation. Privately, definitions were being redrawn. Harry noticed the change not through confrontation, but through absence. Fewer shared briefings, fewer overlapping calls. Their goals, once fused under a single narrative of reinvention, were becoming individually negotiated paths. One evening, reviewing documents alone, Harry came across an early proposal for Amber Crude. The presentation described transformation, legacy, scale. It spoke of building something permanent, an enterprise that would outlast scrutiny because it was grounded in measurable value. He read it twice. What struck him now was not the ambition, but the vagueness. Entire sections relied on access yet to be confirmed, support never formalized, authority assumed rather than granted. The structure had depended on momentum, and momentum had depended on recognition. Without recognition, the framework thinned. Outside, the California sunset moved across the windows in long, gradual bands of light. The house remained quiet, functional, intact. Yet the certainty that had filled it a month earlier had dissipated, replaced by something less dramatic but far more difficult to confront. Prince Harry returned to California carrying far more than exhaustion. The long flight back from Dubai was marked by silence, the kind that presses inward and refuses to release its grip. There were no advisors waiting with solutions, no reassuring calls from influential allies, and no last-minute rescue arranged through old royal channels. The reality he had tried to outrun now sat directly in front of him, undeniable and immovable. The venture that had promised reinvention had instead stripped away the final layer of certainty he believed he still possessed. Inside the Montecito residence, the atmosphere had already shifted. Staff moved carefully, speaking in lowered voices, aware that the household stood on unstable ground. Meghan Markle had withdrawn into private meetings, surrounded by consultants and legal strategists who spoke in the measured language of containment and recalibration. The shared narrative that once defined their public image had fractured into separate calculations, each shaped by survival rather than ambition. What had once been presented as a united departure from royal life now felt like two parallel responses to the same unraveling crisis. Financial reports arrived in thick folders, their numbers stark and unembellished. Investments tied to the proposed energy project had collapsed under scrutiny, leaving obligations that could not be disguised as temporary setbacks. Advisors explained consequences in careful tones, outlining the chain reaction already beginning to spread across accounts and assets. Each explanation sounded procedural, almost clinical, yet beneath the language lay the unmistakable message that recovery would demand far more than reputation management. It would require acceptance of limits that Harry had spent years resisting. News of the failed negotiations circulated quickly through diplomatic and media networks. Commentators framed the episode not as a bold experiment, but as a miscalculation rooted in overreach. Analysts questioned the judgment behind attempting to navigate industries governed by long-standing alliances and regulatory structures. Public perception hardened with surprising speed. The same global attention that had once followed Harry's personal reinvention now examined the consequences of his decisions with relentless precision. Meanwhile, Prince William observed events from London with a deliberate calm that masked deeper concern. Discussions within palace walls focused less on scandal and more on preservation, of institutional relationships, of diplomatic clarity, and of the distinction between personal ventures and constitutional responsibility. The monarchy's response remained measured, but its restraint carried unmistakable finality. There would be no dramatic intervention, no symbolic gesture designed to soften the outcome. The separation between past role and present reality was being reinforced not through confrontation, but through absence. For Harry, the days that followed became defined by adjustment. Meetings once centered on expansion shifted toward reassessment. The language of growth gave way to conversations about accountability, sustainability, and the long-term implications of choices made in moments of urgency. Each discussion forced him to confront a quieter truth. That independence, which had once seemed synonymous with freedom, also demanded an understanding of boundaries he had never fully tested. Beyond the immediate financial strain, another awareness began to surface. The attempt to build something entirely separate from the world he had left behind had not erased that past. It had instead highlighted how deeply it continued to shape expectations around him. Every introduction, every negotiation, every opportunity had carried the shadow of origin, whether acknowledged or not. Stripping that context away proved far more complicated than declaring distance from it. As public attention intensified, the narrative surrounding Harry's journey evolved from spectacle into cautionary reflection. Commentators spoke about identity after departure, about the difficulty of redefining purpose outside inherited structures, and about the risks of seeking validation through ventures designed to prove autonomy rather than sustain it. The story, once framed in terms of rebellion, now read as an examination of consequence. Within the Montecito home, the rhythm of daily life slowed. Decisions were no longer made with the confidence of immediate momentum. Instead, they unfolded gradually, shaped by the understanding that whatever came next would need to endure scrutiny far greater than before. The urgency that had propelled earlier choices gave way to something heavier but more deliberate, a recognition that rebuilding required patience rather than proclamation. The world watched as this next phase began to take shape, not with dramatic announcements, but with subtle shifts in direction. What had collapsed could not simply be replaced. It had to be reconsidered piece by piece under circumstances that allowed little room for illusion. The weeks that followed did not bring resolution. Instead, they introduced a slower, more demanding process, one that required Prince Harry to confront consequences that could not be negotiated away or reframed through public messaging. The urgency of crisis gradually transformed into the weight of permanence. What had happened in Dubai was no longer an isolated humiliation. It had become a defining turning point, one that quietly reshaped how governments, investors, and even former allies evaluated every future approach connected to his name. Morning briefings in Montecito were no longer about expansion, branding, or influence. They centered on containment. Legal teams mapped exposure. Financial consultants restructured obligations. Communications advisors spoke less about visibility and more about restraint. Each conversation carried the same underlying message. Credibility, once strained, does not return through declarations. It must be rebuilt through time, consistency, and an acceptance of limits. Harry found himself navigating an unfamiliar rhythm. For much of his life, movement had been constant: military service, royal duty, global travel, public initiatives. Even after stepping away from official roles, momentum had remained his instinctive response to uncertainty. Now, however, momentum itself had become suspect. Acting too quickly risked repeating the very miscalculations that had led him here. Waiting, listening, and recalibrating demanded a patience he had rarely been required to exercise. Inside the household, the change was equally pronounced. Meghan Markle's professional world moved along its own carefully managed track, structured around selective appearances and controlled engagements designed to stabilize perception rather than dominate headlines. The shared narrative that once fueled joint ventures had been replaced by parallel paths, intersecting occasionally but guided by distinct priorities. It was not a dramatic separation, nor an overt reconciliation of strategy. It was something quieter and more pragmatic, shaped by necessity rather than ideology. Public fascination did not disappear, but it evolved. Early coverage had reveled in spectacle, dissecting the failed venture with dramatic flourish. Over time, commentary shifted toward analysis. Observers began examining the broader implications of reinvention in an age where reputation travels instantly and misjudgment is archived permanently. Harry's experience became less a scandal and more a case study discussed in columns, panels, and policy circles about the fragile boundary between influence and expertise. Across the Atlantic, the royal household maintained its distance. The absence of direct response spoke louder than any formal statement. Institutional continuity remained the priority, and continuity required clarity. The monarchy's role was to endure, not to participate in ventures beyond its constitutional sphere. That distinction, once blurred by personal association, had now been firmly restored. For Harry, the silence carried a finality that no confrontation could have matched. Gradually, attention turned inward. Removed from the immediacy of negotiation and public defense, Harry confronted questions that had lingered beneath years of action. What did independence truly mean if it relied on recognition from the same systems he had tried to leave behind? What did purpose look like when stripped of both inherited structure and ambitious reinvention? These were not questions answered through announcements or initiatives. They demanded reflection, something far less visible but far more difficult. He began engaging in smaller, less public efforts, meetings without press coverage, collaborations absent from promotional schedules, conversations that focused on practical outcomes rather than symbolic gestures. The scale was modest compared to past undertakings, yet the intention differed. Instead of proving transformation, these steps sought to establish steadiness. It was work unlikely to command headlines, but it represented a shift from performance to participation. The financial repercussions remained real, shaping decisions in ways privilege had once shielded him from considering. Budgets required discipline. Projects demanded feasibility rather than aspiration. Advisors no longer deferred automatically. They questioned, challenged, and insisted on evidence. While uncomfortable, the scrutiny also provided structure. It introduced a framework in which ambition had to coexist with accountability. Time, as it often does, altered perception. The narrative of abrupt collapse softened into one of recalibration. Critics remained, but so did a quieter recognition that public figures who attempt to redefine themselves inevitably encounter missteps magnified by visibility. The difference lay not in avoiding failure, but in how one responded after it became unavoidable. By the close of that year, the sense of exile that had followed the Dubai episode had lessened, replaced by something less dramatic yet more sustainable. Harry was no longer chasing validation through grand gestures or distant ventures. The scale of his world had contracted, but within that contraction existed the possibility of clarity, a chance to define contribution without comparison to past roles or imagined futures. The transformation was incomplete, and perhaps always would be. Reinvention rarely arrives as a single decisive act. More often it unfolds through incremental choices, each one quieter than the last, each one testing whether intention can outlast disappointment. For Harry, the journey forward no longer resembled an escape from the life he had known. It resembled an attempt to build something durable enough to stand without the momentum of history or the illusion of sudden success. And in that quieter space, far removed from desert negotiations and global headlines, the real challenge finally began. Not to reclaim what had been lost, but to determine what, if anything, should replace it.